Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, this section is entitled Possible Obstacles to Operations Down a File. And they are listed as follows. 1. The block of granite and how to undermine it. 2. The concept of protected and unprotected obstacles, brackets pawns, close brackets. 3. 2 methods of carrying out an attack on opposing pawns that are in the way. The evolutionary and the revolutionary attack. Nimzowitsch begins this section by re-emphasizing how important the free access we achieved in the last example became, i.e. that there was nothing in the way that should have had to be broken down. He uses the following diagram to show how, usually, a heavy piece can be prevented from reaching the 7th or 8th ranks, simply by blocking the pawn and apparently proclaiming that the rook will get there over the pawn's dead body. Now, if this pawn was protected by another pawn, it would make no sense to try and attack it from the front, as the piece would have to be sacrificed. It would be much smarter, Nimzowitsch writes, to first undermine the support that the pawn has that you wish to attack. For example, here, if white had an h pawn, he could advance it to h5. Like if it was, say it was on h2, he'd go h4, h5, and attack this g6 pawn here. And then you could play h takes g6, and you know, a supporting pawn would have to recapture, and then he could set about properly attacking the g6 pawn with pieces. First move here. But in this instance, the pawn is unprotected anyway. I think there should be a pawn on f7 here, and then you can imagine a pawn marching up and then taking, and then he can attack the g6 pawn properly. So we'll look at that in more detail in just a second. So in this position, the rook is attacking c6, but c6 is supported by b7. So, you know, unless the rook wants to sacrifice itself, it's not going to be able to take on c6. So the correct approach is to undermine the support of the c6 pawn by playing b5. And Nimzowitsch here makes a reference back to his earlier point about a pawn being a sound defensive piece, and that defending instead with pieces, you know, defending pawns with pieces, is almost a misconception, because only a pawn can defend without a complaint over a long period of time. You know, pawns are designed to defend, amongst other things, and pieces are not designed to defend. They're designed, you know, to attack and gain activity. And he continues by saying that in order to attack pawns, we should do so by piling on the pressure with our pieces. And, you know, if they move forward, generally they will be easier to attack, and in any case it's better to restrain them and prevent them from moving forward before attacking them, which often happens anyway, just as a side effect. Our opponent will respond by defending as often as we attack the pawns in question, and an interesting struggle should follow. Once there are an equal amount of attackers and defenders, we can try and gain the advantage by thinning out the ranks of the defenders, which can be done in 3 main ways. Firstly, by driving them away, secondly through exchanging, and thirdly by cutting off one of the defensive pieces. This process therefore transfers the attack from the opposing piece itself to that piece's defenders, you know, which is a logical step, and the end goal remains to win both the material in question and to break down the resistance that our opponent has on that file, so that we can occupy the top 2 ranks. And the following is an example of what Nimzowitsch was talking about. Here, white has reached a good endgame position. Again, if you want to try and work out the winning strategy in accordance with what we've been looking at, then please stop the video now. Rook h2 is the right move here, because it begins the process of what we're talking about, which is attacking this weak h6 pawn. And we can do so directly, so because it's not supported by other pawns, and so it doesn't need to be undermined first or anything like that. So king h7 is the move that black would probably play to defend it. King g7 doesn't work because bishop f8 will be needed to defend this pawn after rook e h1. So now comes bishop f8, and now knight f5 adds a third attacker, and note that it can't be advanced or it simply gets taken, so obviously that's no good. So black has to defend with one of his rooks, so let's say rook b6. And so now there are 3 defenders, the bishop, the rook and the king, as well as 3 attackers, the knight and the 2 rooks. So what is the way to continue now? Again, if you want to try and spot it, then stop the video. d6 simply is the answer, cutting out the rook's defense of h6, which is going to fall and thus allow white decisive penetration on the 7th and 8th ranks with the rooks. Okay, on to the next example. Here's another one. Yeah, it's much simpler this time. If you want to try and spot the move, then again, stop the video now. So if we take a look at it, we can see that white has 2 attackers, black's got 2 defenders. Well, we can take one of them out straight away with knight e6 check. Pretty obvious. So let's say king h7, now knight takes d8, rook takes d8, and rook takes f6. So that's just a clean example of removing defenders by exchange. And the last couple of examples are what Nimzowitsch called evolutionary attacks, i.e. the method of concentrating attackers on one point or piece with the idea of winning material or gaining a positional advantage, and often both at the same time. The revolutionary attack, on the other hand, is significantly different. Okay, so it's white to move here, and on the last move he's played rook h2 with the idea of doubling rooks on the h file to attack h7, the pawn and the square, as well as the black king, of course. So how does he now continue? Again, if you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video. So what do we have to consider here? If we play rook a h1, what happens after h6? You might ask. Or even knight f6, how does white continue to attack? Well, the answer is that white doesn't need to bother with any of that, because he can of course play rook takes h7 check, which is forcing mate on the next move. The bishop has got g8 covered, so king takes h7 is forced, and now rook h1 is mate. There's no squares for the black king. So playing instead, as I said, rook a h1 is not as decisive, because knight f6 or h6, and either of those have the effect of creating a so-called block of granite on the h file, and it's much harder for down, although he's still obviously winning, but it doesn't win as quickly. And the sacrifice we saw was simple, but to Nimzowitsch it was a hugely significant thing, because it clearly demonstrates the difference between an evolutionary and revolutionary attack. So let's have a look at another example. In this position, white can follow the evolutionary attack in order to win h7 as follows. Rook A h1, it's attacking h7, you know, so knight f8 is forced, and now we can remove the defender with bishop e7. So let's say rook e8, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, rook takes h7. And this is a probable draw, this position here. Neither side has much of an advantage. Okay, white has the h-file, but that doesn't lead to too much, and black can gain these center files. The pawns are equal, and you know, it's looking drawish from here. However, of course, there's something much stronger than rook A h1. Again, if you want to try and spot the move, then stop the video now. This one's a little more obvious and easier, and shows some of the dangers of losing your fiancé shadow bishop and allowing your opponent to have bishop of that color. Rook takes h7, of course, is the move. It's forcing mate in 2 moves. You know, and as before, white forcibly clears away to the top ranks with a sacrifice in order to deliver mate. So king takes h7 is forced, rook h1 check, king g8, and rook h8 is mate. Nimzowitsch finishes this section by making the observation that, generally speaking, the evolutionary attack will come before the revolutionary one, i.e., by applying piece pressure on our opponent, we should be able to force his defending pieces into uncomfortable positions where they get into each other's way, as often the defending side will suffer from a lack of space. After that has been achieved, it should be possible to break through with a forcing revolutionary attack, amongst other things. And you know, it goes without saying that we should be able to see these attacks within the positions, and you know, that's something that can't really be taught. You have to learn it through practice and sharpen your eyes and find those things yourself. Okay, that's the end of part 2.